So it is the month of Elul, and we've been focusing a lot on things that are related to Elul, as we should do at this time of the year. That's the correct thing to do, is to focus on things that have to do with the month of Elul. One of the things that we're taught regularly throughout the Torah is that when something is written in the parsha, and that parsha happens to coincide with a particular date on the calendar, then there must be a correlation between the two. So it's not accidental. You know, that this time of the year we happen to read that time of that parsha. It's not accidental. It's always quite specific, and that means that there's a lesson to be learnt between the two, you know, the association between the two. So we're in the month of Elul, which is supposed to be this month of personal growth and development and reflection. It's quite an intense month, actually, when you really pay attention to it. It's quite an intense month. So what are the parashas that we read at this time? Because they'll give us a lot of insight as to what it is that we're supposed to do. Well, one of them, which is the parasha we'll read this week, starts off by saying, Ki seitzei lamilchama al oivecha, when you go out to war on your enemies. And then it tells us details that are related to the war, specifically the detail of what happens v'shavisa shivyoy, when you take captives. So there are quite a number of different commentaries and insights about this. What kind of a war are we talking about? Because in Judaism there are different kinds of wars. There's milchemes mitzvah, milchemes choiva, milchemes rishus. Some wars are a mitzvah. Other wars are an obligation, which means that it's even stronger in a sense than a mitzvah. And some wars are voluntary wars, which means that if the circumstances are appropriate and the leadership decides that you have to fight such a war, then you go ahead and you fight it. In any event, whichever way you look at it, here the Torah is very clear, ki seitzei, you go out to war. In other words, if you're in your own space, you don't have to fight any wars. Ki seitzei, you've got to go out of your space in order to fight a war. And then it tells us, ki seitzei lamilchama, when you go to war, al oivecha. It doesn't say neged oivecha, that you go to war against your enemies. The Torah specifies that you go to war on your enemy, which immediately implies that there's a hierarchy over here and there's a positioning where you're at a higher position than the enemy is. So you come from a position of confidence. You begin the process with a sense that you believe you're going to actually be victorious. So you're al oivecha. You come with this kind of superior perspective over the enemy. And then the ultimate goal of the war is v'shavisa shivyoy. Not only should you fight the war and win the war, but shavisa shivyoy, you should bring back captives. Whether those captives are human captives, which is the direct translation of shivyoy, that you take a human being as captive, and that's how the Torah continues. But the truth is, it extends further and a little bit more generically, that it also refers to items, whether it be gold, silver, chveis, property, whatever it is that you take from the enemy and you bring back into your own space. So how does that relate to and connect with the story of Elul? Elul is the month when we're supposed to reflect on ourselves, and it's the month when we're supposed to consider how well have we done. It's kind of your scorecard on the previous year. So last year, Rosh Hashanah, we probably said certain things to ourselves. I'm going to try this, I'm going to be better at that, and whatever. We made resolutions. So now is the time you take stock and you work out, how did we do? How did we do in terms of our spiritual development? And as soon as you start to make that kind of an assessment, well, one of the things that you'll probably recognize is that there's an enemy. It's all very nice for us to say, I'd like to do all of these things, and I plan to do all these things, and I'd like to grow, and so on and so forth. Very quickly you realize that you have an enemy. And the enemy of our spiritual progress is not an external enemy. It's not somebody. You know, very often people like to blame somebody. It's their fault because that person, that I'm not able to achieve what I have to achieve. So the enemy out there. What the Torah wants us to understand, even though at face value it's talking about exactly that. Ki seitzei, you've got to go out of yourself, out of your environment to fight against an enemy which is in a different location. But spiritually, al oivecha, where's this enemy? This enemy is actually inside of myself. It's wired into my own head. It's the enemy of my self-defeatist attitude. It's the enemy of my laziness. It's the enemy of my apathy, of my cynicism, of my temptations. Whatever the particular thing is, everybody has their particular enemy that is built inside of themselves. And over the course of this month of Elul, two things happen. The one thing is that we spend some time assessing, how have I done? How did it work? Did I overcome the enemy? Did the enemy overcome me? Where exactly do I stand? That's one thrust of the month of Elul. And many people fixate on that part of Elul, which is appropriate because it is a month of reflection. However, if you get stuck there, and you don't progress to the next step, then you're stuck. What's the next step? Do something about it. Ki seitze la-milchama. Go out and battle against all of those things that perhaps you believed were insurmountable. Because very often what happens to a person is you say, look, now if I'm honest with myself and I'm doing this introspection, I'm doing this reflection, then I know who I am and I know what my vices are and I know what kind of problems I've had over the course of history and I know that I'm not going to fix them anytime soon. No. Ki seitze la-milchama. The implication of a war is that it's going to take a tremendous amount of effort and a tremendous amount of skill and strategizing and a certain level of risk. That's what a war is that you put yourself at risk. Unfortunately, often people are so risk averse that they won't allow themselves to try to change, because what happens if I fail? What happens if I let myself down? What happens if I then realize that it's insurmountable? So ki seitze, the first thing to do, ki seitze, that's it. Go out. Go, take the step. Move in a direction. So often people are completely paralyzed by all of their concerns and the fears of the what ifs. What if I try and it fails? What if I try and people think that I'm strange? What if I try and I land up going too radical and then I lose my personality or I lose the connections and friendships that I used to have with other people? There are a myriad different thoughts that a person has in their mind of exactly what could potentially go wrong when it is that you want to go out and tackle this so-called enemy. So the first thing it tells us, ki seitze, take a step, go, move in a direction. You don't necessarily have to know where it all lands up. Then you have to recognize something else up here, and this is very, very interesting. Ki seitze la-milchama, if you have to go out to war, that implies that the place that you're at, fundamentally, is a place where there is no battle. And that's really important for us to know, because if you had to tell a person, you've got to change, and that's what we do say at this time of the year, whether we say it to somebody else, or whether we say it to ourselves, you've got to change. So there's an implied message over there, which is, you're obviously not okay. That's why you've got to change. And the implied message of that sounds like there's something wrong with you. That's why you've got to change. And people find it very difficult to accept that and very difficult to hear it. That's why often when you offer what people consider constructive criticism, the person who's listening on the other end does not find it so constructive and they're not so happy to accept it. Why? Because there's an implication if you're criticizing me or if you tell me that I've got to do something and change something and move something about myself. So the insinuation is I'm no good as I am right now. So here comes a very interesting insight that the parasha wants us to know. The milchama, the war that you have to fight, even if it's the war against your own yetzer hara, the war against your own toxic thinking, against your own bad habits, against your own temptations, you have to realize ki seitze la-milchama. In order to get to the war front, you actually are stepping outside of who you really are. It's a fascinating way of looking at it. In other words, there's two sides to the same phrase. On the one side, the phrase is saying, ki seitze, go out there and do something. Don't sit and pontificate. Don't sit and overanalyze, as people tend to do. What if I try this method? What if I do that method? Should I sign up to that shiur? Should I do this program? Should I adopt that mitzvah? By the time you've worked it all out, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are over. So the first perspective is, ki seitze, just go out and do something. But the second, deeper perspective is recognize that if you're in the arena of conflict, if you're battling with whatever it is that you're battling with, this particular yetzer hara, that particular distraction, this particular apathy or whatever it is, if you're battling with it, you need to know that means ki seitze. It means you've actually stepped out of the core of who you are. Because the core of who you are, the real essence, the neshama in its pristine form, which can never be corrupted, so that part of ourselves never has to fight a war. And that's the implied message over here. Ki seitze, I go out into a particular environment in order to fight, in order to battle, in order to struggle, to try and get my spirituality on track. However, I know deep down within myself that that's not where I really live. If I was in touch with who I really am, if I could experience my neshama as it really is, I would not be having this battle. And the Rebbe points out a very interesting thing that, as we've said, the timing of things and the dates and the correlation between the parasha and the date on the calendar is obviously very carefully chosen. So it's quite interesting that on Shabbos, we'll, please God, read the parasha of Ki seitze, but in the morning. In the afternoon, we'll read the beginning of the next parasha, which is Ki savoi. Ki seitze is the parasha that talks about the battle environment, And Kisavoy talks about the resting environment, when you come into the promised land and you'll be able to sit and be settled and plant your fields and reap the produce. So how do you accommodate both of those on the same Shabbos? How could the same Shabbos be talking about go out to war and sit at home in peace? So the Rebbe explains, because both of them are true. We're a paradoxical set of people. On the one hand, if you get inside the neshama is always at peace. The neshama never has to fight a war. The neshama can never be corrupted. And so the neshama is always in a state of peace. The practical reality that I live is that I have to battle and try and overcome certain aspects of my life. So you put the two together to say, even when I'm out there trying to battle, I need to know that I'm stepping away from my essence to fight this battle, but I have to retreat back to my essence and recognize that I'm actually connected. Deep down within myself, I'm 100% connected. I'm totally aligned with Hashem. It's just that I have to step out of it because Hashem expects me to step up to certain challenges. That's why I go out and fight the war. Not because I am at war in the core of my being, but because that's what Hashem expects of me. It's definitely something we can work on over the next few days, weeks.